Okay, here we go. Aloha students. Today we're going to continue with the discussion of the Industrial Revolution. One of the things I call this Industrial Revolution Part 2. One of the things I wanted to sort of comment about in regards to the first part was that in the Western world, in the United States, we sort of take the Industrial Revolution for granted. We just accept that's the way it is. We understand that we're in the fourth stage, what I call the technological revolution. Remember, it went agriculture, commercial, industrial, technological, and look, there's dispute. Lots of historians dispute. Don't take that as written in stone. That is exactly like that. There's interpretations. But what I would say to you is the fact of the matter is that there are certain. We take it for granted. There are certain nations in the world today that have not industrialized yet. They're not even there. They're not even at that point. They're struggling in some cases with agriculture, sometimes with long distance trade. And then my point, you got to sort of go through those, I think, to get to these. Part of it goes back to my discussion about within world history class about the advancement of civilizations and the box out of box discussion and those types of things. Okay? All right, so let's continue with this and we'll see some of the things going on here that you'll find interesting, I think. And what I sort of say here is that today is going to be about the major concepts of the Industrial Revolution. Basically, the Industrial Revolution started in the country of England in about 1750, right in the middle of the 1700s. And we'll discuss some negatives of the industrialization, which I think a lot of you are familiar with already. Okay, so the first one, major concepts. All right, so let's sort of just go through this. I have about 5 things I want to say about this. First thing is that we sort of think about industry and we think about factories and all those types of things, and we think about assembly lines and making machines making machines. Well, one of the first industries, dare I say, that got industrialized was agriculture. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is, where was the vast majority of people who were a market? Remember, one of the things a nation needs is a marketplace, a market of people that want to buy products. Well, where did most people live? Most people still lived on farms. And so industrialists wanted to make products that appealed to people that did agriculture. And so you start to see machines that helped with the production of agriculture, made the production of agriculture easier. And along with this comes other things like the mass production of windmills and things like that that can assist the farmer in his job, getting more production. Plows were now mass produced. You start to see, obviously, when we get into automobiles and things like that, the tractors, etc. All these things set up to help the farmer improve agriculture, and that's exactly what it does. And if you improve your agriculture, you have a bigger population, you'll have more people moving to the cities. Look, we talk a lot about, in the modern times, we talk a lot about diversifying how we do energy and getting away from regular sources of power into alternate sources of power, newer sources of power. This is not new. This discussion that we're having about this is not new. And what I'm trying to say here is that the Industrial Revolution really, when it started, basically, for lack of a better way of putting it, industrialists said, all hands on deck. We'll use whatever we can to get power. And you can see, obviously, burning fossil fuels. Again, the stereotypical thing, burning the coal to create heat, to melt the metal. But you notice here, what else do I have? I have wind, water, and steam. And these are things we would sort of say today, we would sort of think of, steam is maybe not the best example, but certainly wind and water power are certainly the alternate types of powers that we think of that we should be using today. Of course, one of the other ones is solar power we use today, not too much back when the Industrial Revolution started. But certainly wind power was one of the main things, and I just talked about windmills a moment ago. Water wheels, I guess, dams is the other best thing to sort of talk about. yeah, steam requires a little bit of burning of fossil fuel to help get things going. As you think about steam locomotives in the rail industry, all right? Look, this is one of the most important things, probably the most important thing, you could argue, about the Industrial Revolution is this concept of mass production. And I made the point of this in part number 1 about how you can have the discussion, what's better, mass production or somebody making something one at a time. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. But the fact cannot be denied that the assembly line concept that we think of was one of the first things that came out of this. And we really, probably more than anybody else, the person you should think about that was responsible for that was an American guy named Henry Ford. Have you ever heard of Ford's? Well, you know what Henry Ford's factories made? I bet you do. One of the things I sort of also added in part 1 was the fact that we start to see these individuals who really push industries, particular industries, forward at a very quick pace. And these guys become super wealthy. And what they often try to do is they try to create monopolies over entire industries. And of course, if you've all played the game Monopoly, the whole point is you try to own all the properties in one block, okay? And you can charge whatever you want. That's sort of what started to happen. And you started to see this with guys like Rockefeller in the oil industry, all right, and Vanderbilt and the steam industry. You see this with railroad guys where they're trying to control over an entire branch of that particular economy. All right, capitalistic control, super wealthy private individuals, all right, that are trying to do these types of things. The fifth thing that I would say is one of the things that the Industrial Revolution does is it increases the speed of all this stuff. Things are going to happen way faster because they're part of industrialization is the improvement of efficiency. Yes, transportation is going to be much faster. We're going to see this in warfare as well. Transportation of goods and services and people. Certainly, railroads is the earliest example of this. Communication, if you can move people faster than the Pony Express, a bunch of guys galloping on horses across the prairie, you're going to have faster communication speed. One of the products, by the way, of the Industrial Revolution was the telegraph. Massive production of wires, and suddenly you see telegraph poles. Okay, we see telephone poles and things like that today, but it was telegraph poles in those times. All right, so that's the first part. All right, so the next part is, why would a place like England be the place where the Industrial Revolution started? Okay, so one of the things you got to keep in mind here is England is on these islands. Okay, we call them the British Islands. That's why it's called the British Empire, Great Britain. Those are a series of islands that include the big one where England is, England, Wales, and Scotland. The other big one is Ireland and Northern Ireland today, but there's lots of other smaller islands all the way around those two big ones. So we call those the British Islands. But England is the main country of the British Islands and the one that has dominated the British Islands. So the fact I'm trying to get at is England is an island nation, which all of you certainly get. There are certain disadvantages of geography living on an island. We think about Japan, we think about Hawaii. You should really sort of think about the same thing about England, but England is able to overcome a bunch of these things at this particular time, and there are several reasons, and one of them is political. And the English do something that is different than, say, the Japanese, for example. All right, the English basically restrict the power of their monarch. They become a constitutional monarchy. They keep the king or queen around. As you know, England has a queen today. They keep them around, but they are limited in power. The constitutional monarchy limits their power. Whereas Japan kept an emperor all the way up through, really there's an emperor today, but the power was all vested and centralized in the emperor all the way up through World War II. So in 1688, England had one of these revolutions in which the power of the king was restricted once again. Maybe you recall the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was in 1215, and it was the first attempt to limit the power of the king. And you may say, didn't that work? Well, it kind of worked, but you know, kings didn't necessarily love the Magna Carta, and so they had to go through this process again. All right. What you'll discover when you, again, I've tried to make this point to all of you through 2 courses now, when you have big government, you are going to struggle with the issues and problems of, there are certain things that come along with big government, and one of those is the increase in this amount of corruption and how much the middleman takes from any transaction. So person A, person B, they want to have a transaction with each other. The bigger the government is, the government's going to get in the middle of that transaction to affect that transaction for what the government will call the greater good. So the British government had to come down in size, became more stable. We see less waste, we see less corruption in England of all places. And so if you have that, then you have what is ultimately a business-friendly nation. And that's exactly what happened. Business people want to do business. They don't want to be hindered and restricted by government. So the Revolution of 1688 reduced the power of the British government, made it less wasteful. All right, you didn't have to pay off crooked politicians along the way, and then therefore business grew in that place. All right, and again, we're talking about 1750. Okay, so we're ahead of the United States here. We're ahead of other nations of Europe. We're ahead of Asian nations like China and Japan in those kinds of concepts, those kinds of ideas. I mean, you think about Japan today, talk about a business-friendly nation, the attempt, right? That's because you can make the argument, going back to the end of World War II, when the power of the emperor was completely dismantled. There's something else about England that is also a part of this, is the fact that these are historically ocean-going people. They're ocean traders, and therefore, because they were historically people of commerce, long-distance traders, they built a strong navy and always had a strong navy. Why do you build a strong navy? Well, you build a strong navy to protect your trade routes. The British Navy protects trade routes, and the British Navy did this for almost 400 years. They protected international trade, all the way from really their great victory over the Spanish Armada in the late 1500s all the way through World War II. And to be honest with you, just so you know this, who protects the great trade routes of the oceans today? What navy does that? Well, I think you can guess it's the United States Navy. Has really protect freedom of the seas and the movement of goods quickly and safely. That's been the United States Navy. So this is not without historical precedence what's going on. But my point that I'm trying to make here is that it became natural for business to thrive even more so, or shall I say maybe not natural, but it was made easier for business to thrive faster, as I mentioned in number 3, because of the fact that this is what the British had done. They were ocean-going, trading people with a strong navy. All right? And because of this, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work available. These business people want to move their business quickly. Now, again, what's the problem with an island? Limited population. Well, guess what happened? You had people from France and Germany, and mostly France and Germany, to be honest with you. They came to England looking for work. They wanted to get away from these are really northern and western Europeans that are coming. You didn't see too many you might have seen some Italians, but you saw a lot of people from the rest of Europe coming to England looking for work. So business attracted these immigrants coming from the European continent. Okay, and so you think, oh, this is all very wonderful and nice and really good and really good stuff. That's very fascinating, Miss O'Brien, as is everything in your class. Well, look, that is true. I admit that, but there is also an element here that we need to discuss, and that is that there were some negatives that came out of this whole thing. There were absolutely some problems that devolved, if you will, shall I say, out of the Industrial Revolution. And these are the sort of the stereotypical things that we really probably think of more than anything else. I think that most people think of this list before they think of things that are positive that came out of the Industrial Revolution. So one of these, of course, is pollution, the stereotypical smokestacks with again, the burning of coal to melt the metal, to create the new metal. The burning creates smoke and ash and things. Where do they go? It goes up the chimney, goes up the smokestack, and then, of course, the city is polluted. And there is validity to that. Part of the issue with refugees and immigrants coming from other places, we see this, as a matter of fact, you'll see this in number 5, you'll see this happening in the United States as well. You see a lot of overcrowding in cities and people coming from the countryside looking for work in the cities, and immigrants coming from other places looking for work in cities. And you had cities who were woefully, dare I say, unprepared. And so then you have unsanitary. And what I mean by that is, do the cities have the best way to put this is, do they have the sewer systems ready? Probably not. Do they have paved roads necessarily for sure in these cities? If they do, probably not many. And so now you have mud, you have dirt, you have trash in the streets, you have human waste in the streets. It's not good. One of the things we also see, I have down here, poor housing conditions. Well, one of the things about that is we see overcrowding. Cities have not prepared for the influx of new residents, so they don't have enough housing. And so what do you have? You have immigrant families living on top of each other, multiple people living in one unit. Again, is there a sewer system? Are there pipes? Are those things ready? Probably not. You have huge problem with traffic in these situations as well. Look, there's a lot of things that were also bad, and one of those was that the factory owners would try to keep the factories going, if not 6 days a week, 7 days a week. They rarely even wanted to give people Saturdays off. So you have unfair work practices like 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week, keeping the factory going. All right, massively producing massive amounts of whatever the factory, the product that is being produced. Keep it going. All right. Low wages on top of that. So you have all these, you got somebody that's got to work massive amounts of hours, but then what are you doing? You're paying them barely a wage at all. You have unfair hiring and firing, to be honest with you. You have, the next one we'll talk about conditions. You have child labor. Child labor was significant because you could pay a child less. Talk about low wages. The idea was this was unskilled labor, so therefore, why do we need to hire an adult male? We'll just hire some little kid who can, all he's got to do is replace a part 3 times a day and watch the machine run. We don't have to pay a child anything. All right. These are very scary places at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There's not a lot of concern put into safety. There's not a lot of concern put into sanitary conditions. And people and guys would get hurt a lot. And if guys got hurt, then you had this unfair practices and getting hired. Compensation rules that we think of are totally normal today. Getting sick time and getting sick days and getting paid. Those things did not happen at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Those who got injured, those who got in tough situations, man, nothing was there to help them out. Nothing. Okay? And you would say, well, why do we have those things today? Well, there's 2 reasons. The second reason, I'll give you the first reason here in a moment. The reason why we have much of this stuff taken care of today is that the government has come in and they've regulated these factories, which is, you'd have to argue that's a good thing. Thank goodness they did this, because these other 1 through 6 are not good. But at the beginning, there was no government regulation. And again, this is unprecedented. The Industrial Revolution is brand new. There's no history to look back on and say, how did they do it? How did these other group of... There's none of that. So this is all brand new. So governments are behind for a long time working on the things that would keep people safe, keep people healthy, keep people working, keep people from being disposable, if you will. All right? So those things, that was not happening at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so what do you sort of see? This will change as time goes along with better number 7, and without what I might add here in just a moment is that you basically did not see much. You saw very wealthy people, and unfortunately poor people stayed poor. Now I'm going to argue as we go along this is going to change, but at the beginning this is one of the negatives of industrialization. Now what I just said a moment ago, the reason 1 through 6 has changed for 2 reasons. I said the second reason was governments came in and did start to regulate things and make things safer. The first reason why 1 through 6 were eventually got fixed was this, and it has to do with the concept of unions. Okay, so this is something that I'm going to just touch on here to begin with, and then I'm going to come back in the next movie when I discuss I'll discuss unions in more specific terms. Now, there's unions still to this very day, and unions are still very popular, and I would say they're losing their popularity, but they're still certainly around. Okay, now what is a union? We'll get into that in more details here and the next time. Well, a union is the result of industrialization. Unions would not exist if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution. Unions are groups of workers. How's that sound? And they use the concept of strength in numbers. So unions are organized workers who organize themselves to deal with the negatives of industrialization. How's that sound? Workers who organize themselves to deal with the negatives of industrialization. All right, and their main strength is their numbers, the amount of them, and we will see that sometimes unions would go on strike. I mean, you've heard of that, right? They went on strike. That means the workers just decided we're not going to work today. All right, and so again, we'll come back and I'll give you some more details about unions. But let me just say this: is that much of what we see of how the negatives of the Industrial Revolution got fixed had to do with early unions and the work that early unions did. And again, perfect, we're not going to have 6-day weeks. They fought for 5-day weeks. We're not going to have 12 to 14-hour days. We're going to have 8-hour days and things like that. That was the simplest way to do that. And the union would say, hey, ownership, if you don't agree with that, we'll go on strike. Just in a very simplistic way of looking at it. All right? So, but I would also say, let's keep this in mind as well. Here is one of the great results. And I'm not saying great in like, yay, this is the best thing that ever happened. I'm saying one of the biggest results of the early negatives of the Industrial Revolution, and the negatives that lead to the ideas of this particular person. His name was Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is going to end up being one of the most influential people of history, of modern world history. He is a German author and philosopher, I would argue, that he's a German guy, and I think I just said that. He's a German guy, and he comes up with an economic system which is really social and political as well, and this theory is going to have widespread influence and going to create some very interesting conflicts in and of itself. And I would argue that we are still talking about this guy to this very day. He's still popular to this very day, even though he is one of the most controversial people of history. All right? Okay. All right. So that is it for this. I will come back with a Industrial Revolution number 3 next time. So be ready. All right? Okay, folks. Thank you very much. Hope you're thinking out there. Thinking. We'll see you next time. Aloha.